Hi, this is Jürgen Rasmussen. Welcome to the Provocative Hypnosis blog. I want to talk a little bit today about how personal growth and increased maturity leads to new problems. There's this myth often being sold in personal development, self-improvement circles, what I refer to as the myth of the stairway to heaven. This notion that one day you will be issue free and no longer have any perceived problems. And there's this kind of stairway to heaven where you get increasingly less neurotic as you develop as a human being and mature psychologically. There's also this popular notion that whatever perceived issue you may have right now, that it kind of stems from your background or your childhood, and that you have to somehow revisit that and uproot that and work with that to have better relationships or a better experience of life in present time. So I want to challenge these notions a little bit. And what I want to introduce to you is that personal growth or increased maturity actually very often results in new problems. They might be more interesting problems, they might be more complex problems. But quite a few of the problems that people have, you need certain, let's call it structural capacities to have those problems. And you didn't have those structural capacities earlier in life. So before I go into this, I need to define a couple of terms. I'm going to use the terms subject and object. So when I use the term object, I mean that which is experienced, something you can look at and have a relationship to. When I use the term subject, I mean that which you are fused with or embedded in, or the ideas and assumptions that kind of have you, that you view the world through. So, for example, the first time, if you have kids, the first time you catch your kid in a deliberate, cunning, well planned out lie, that's cause for celebration. From a developmental perspective, that's a monumental achievement. Because consider what it takes or what structural capacities you need to have to be able to lie in a kind of planned, deliberate way. Well, you need the capacity to recognize that other peoples have minds of their own that are distinct from yours, so that they can know things you can't and you can know things that they can't. Consider a young child in his kind of magical thinking phase. So, for example, I've observed my 4-year-old son, previously, like a year ago, when he would talk to my father, who lives quite a bit of a distance away, on the phone. He would often describe things and point to things in the room as if his grandfather could see them. So my son at that time did not seem to have the capacity to be able to see, look, I can see the stuff in the room that I'm in, but my grandfather can't because he's located, a different place in the country, right? So very young kids, when they are in that kind of magical thinking phase, they often, have the perception that if the lights get turned off, the world kind of disappears. Or they might be showing someone on the phone things in the room that they're in, oblivious to the fact that the other person can't see it because they're not there to see it. So when a kid begin, of course, even young kids lie. They refuse having done things they've done, and stuff like that. But I'm talking about that kind of deliberate, planned lie. To be able to do that, you again need the capacity to differentiate your mind from other people's minds. So in that sense, you suddenly get the idea that, wait a minute, I can know things that this other person can't know, or that person can know things that I can't know. So the capacity to lie in a deliberate way is, from a developmental perspective, a monumental achievement. Consider, for example, guilt. Young people don't really have, young children don't really have guilt. People who operate from early psychological stages of development don't really have guilt. They may say they have guilt, you know. So a lot of teenagers or young adults who operate from a kind of pre-socialized mind, in a sense, they might say that they're guilty, but if you kind of inquire a bit into what that means, you discover that what they refer to as guilt is more a worry of sorts, of what the other person might do to them as a result of finding out what they've done. That's not really guilt, you know. But so for example, a person who's subject to his own enduring interests and perceived needs will view other people through that lens. So other people are kind of a supplier to the self, in a sense. So the relationships tend to be very, very transactional. I scratch your back, you scratch mine. They can take multiple perspectives, but just one at a time. To be able to really experience guilt the way adults kind of conceptualize it, you need to construct your own sense of self in such a way that other people's experiences or the cultural norms or some religious teaching, these external perspectives are internalized, and so that we can kind of co-create our very sense of self out of it. So if I'm religious, for example, and I've internalized, for example, Christian values, then those internalized values become a huge part in how I experience myself. So if I then, as a Christian, and I'm not a Christian, but just as an example, if I then fail to live up to the tenets of the Bible, I might have guilt because failing to live up to those internalized standards directly affect how I experience myself. Or if I'm married or have a relationship, or then how significant others perceive me directly influences my very experience of self, right? This is a very different level of guilt than I'm kind of worried about what someone else might do to me or what the consequences might be to me as a result of finding out what I did, right? It's very, very different. Another way of having guilt, of course, would be to take a step back from one's cultural surrounds or family religion or whatever it might be, and to kind of developing one's own set of values and principles, and experiencing guilt due to not having lived up to your own standards for what you deem to be right conduct in a particular setting. You know, that's a more self-authored guilt. It's a very different way to conceptualize guilt than the socialized type of guilt that I referred to previously, or the kind of worry guilt. So imagine like you have a hypnotherapist who sells you the idea that we're going to use timeline therapy or hypnotic regression to clear all guilt from the past. But these forms of guilt are not the same. You probably won't be able to, they don't stem from your past. Most of it stems from your current capacity to make meaning, right? So this is why sometimes when you work with clients, people can, begin to have a conscience or feel guilt due to things they have done 10 years ago, which didn't really bother them then because they were kind of fused with their own needs and wants. But now, as they've internalized some religious teaching or some political ideology or kind of been socialized, now they begin to feel heavy guilt as a result of constructing their very sense of self differently. This ability to internalize external perspectives and kind of co-construct your sense of self out of them so that a part of society becomes part of you and you become part of society. You know, this this is a huge developmental achievement for someone who was previously fused with their own needs and wants. So, for example, the capacity to feel true guilt, to really have a conscience, is the same structural capacity that allows someone to become a suicide bomber. The very structural capacities that allow someone to become a suicide bomber is a huge developmental achievement contrasted with someone who used to view the world exclusively through his or her own needs and wants, right? So the person who does that is not going to become a suicide bomber because if you're going to become a suicide bomber, you need to internalize an ideology and co-construct a sense of self based upon how well your behavior coheres with that internalized ideology. You know, before you can do that, you're not going to be motivated by psychological abstractions such as duty or honor or sanctity or the divine or self-sacrifice to something bigger. Like it's not going to compute. Now, of course, most people who have been socialized, who have that socialized mind at the world stage, are not suicide bombers. But I'm talking about the structural capacities you would need to have to truly be a suicide bomber. So the very same structural capacities that allows for true guilt, a conscience, shared mutuality, loyalty, being part of something bigger, to be able to have a relationship, to be a loyal team player, to be part of a community, are the same structural capacities that allow someone to become a Nazi or a communist or a suicide bomber or a woke social justice activist or a radical feminist who might argue that women deserve to be believed in the sense that if you're a man, you're you should automatically be disbelieved because a woman has made the claim, right? So it's this ethnocentric, tribal, group-based identity where if you are part of us, if you are also a woman or a trans person or whatever it might be, you have certain rights. But if you're not part of that group, uh, you should not have those rights. So if you look at the theocracies or the old Nazi Germany or fascism or communist states or what have you, they all kind of require the same structural capacities. Now, to have a true democracy or to have a more like libertarian or free society, that would require very different structural capacities. Because if you look at a democracy, and we could argue whether we really have a democracy, I would say that we don't. But it kind of presupposes an individual rights revolving around an individual who can take a step back and judge and evaluate for himself what he thinks is right and then kind of vote, right? That requires a different sense of responsibility and agency compared to just being part of a group and having, being a good citizen or father or partner defined for you through the culture. Consider something else. Let's say that someone has been largely fused with their own perceived enduring interests and needs for a long time, and they kind of begin that journey towards a more socialized mind, and they end up in a relationship, and they suddenly have this sense of shared mutuality and meaning and intimacy but this is the only place in life where the person has that. And let's say that this partner now suddenly leaves. This person might be devastated for a long time and struggle for a really long time to recover from the relationship breakup. Whereas 2 years ago, when they were operating at a earlier meaning making stage, the same breakup might not have affected them that strongly because they had more of that transactional thing going on. But now, as a result of being able to experience shared meaning and mutuality and a different form of intimacy in this one context of their mind, and having that kind of taken away, there's a loss of self of sorts that can be devastating to deal with. Consider something else. People who suddenly begin to be concerned with ethical business. Previously, success may have been defined by the fast cars and the money and the designer clothes and the kind of trophy girlfriends and stuff like that, or it may have been defined by just the culture that they were part of. But let's say that they take a step back and they begin to develop more self-reflection and more of a psychological self that has its own principles and values. And this person might begin to become disturbed with how they make a living or the ethics behind the success that they're having. Versus 5 years previously, they may not have been disturbed by that at all. Not because they were less neurotic, not because they have had greater presence of mind, but just because they couldn't see it. They didn't have the perspective taking or the mental complexity to even begin to see such things. So imagine the madness in treating something like that as an issue to be solved by exploring their childhood and their past, right? Well, I'll give another example. I worked with a guy a few years ago who told a story of many years previously being a lay judge in a court case. And he thought that the case seemed a bit fishy and was far from convinced that the person at trial was actually guilty of what he was being accused of. But the main judge came in and said, "This guy's clearly guilty. We just have to convict this guy," and he he kind of just did that with a lot of authority, and my client just signed it, as did the other person. And at the time, it didn't bother my client that much because he thought, well, the judge kind of knows best, and I essentially just followed orders. But many years later, as a result of doing more reading and becoming more independent and reflecting more and looking into the legal system, that thing he did back then increasingly started to bother him. He started to hold himself responsible for not sticking up for that person, not protesting, not voicing his concerns. So when I worked with him, this was a topic for that particular person. But 10 years previously, when it actually happened, it wasn't really that big of a deal. Now, was he less neurotic back then? I don't think so. Did he have more presence of mind? Nope. But as a result of maturing psychologically, he was able to take responsibility for his own contribution in a way where he previously just kind of attributed it to the situation and the judge. So I hope I hope these perspectives have brought some food for thought. If you have any questions or comments, please write them where you find the video. If my way of thinking resonates with you, know that I see clients on Skype from all over the world. If you want to book a session with me, you can reach me at provocativehypnosis.com. If you're watching this in 2022, I'm doing a seminar on how I work with clients who have chronic pain and psychosomatic issues, November 25th and 26th. If you're curious about that, you can also go to provocativehypnosis.com in the seminar page and have a look. I'll also be speaking at the UK Hypnosis Convention in November. It's a talk called the Psychological Illusion Model 2.0. Anyways, thanks for listening. Till next time.